a few months ago I had the experience of being lacerated by Hamish MacDonald on Radio National, and I didn't like it, but it was only one interview over one issue. It made me think again as I walked through the Howard Library and saw pictures of Mr 18%, that if that were me, I don't know that I continue. But he did, and determination and resolution are things that I, perhaps now having that little experience of my own, have more in admiration for John Howard. That's a preface to say he's had a whole lot of people saying a whole lot of things about him over the last 36 hours, and finally his chance comes to reply. Please welcome Mr Howard.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Can I start by thanking you and Andrew and all the other team at the Howard Library for organising this conference. Can I thank everybody who's participated, either by making a contribution or attending. I've found the last couple of days really interesting. Now, I've learnt a number of things I didn't know before. I haven't fundamentally altered my views about certain things, but I really do appreciate the contributions of people, and I particularly appreciate the presence and involvement of a number of my former parliamentary colleagues, those who survived the loss in 2007, such as Philip and Brendan, and those who didn't, such as Philip and Gary. I thank you very warmly, and I also acknowledge, importantly, the presence of a lot of my former staff. I do appreciate it, and I like the involvement of people such as Roger Beale, a former departmental secretary during the time that I was Prime Minister, and former advisors. Mr McClure, thank you very much for your contributions, and to everybody. I've just got a couple of responses and observations. And finally, on a personal note, I'm so pleased that Michael Danby is here. Michael was one of those Labor members, and there were quite a lot of them that I respected a great deal. And he was a colleague who across the aisle, who I always tried to include in certain gatherings that I knew were very, very important to him. And it's always good to get a Labor Party perspective at a gathering such as this. I suppose when you've been in power for almost 12 years, the key question is, why do you lose? Well, you lose for a combination of reasons. I think it's fair to distill that the majority view of the contributors was that we lost because of longevity, we lost because of certain aspects of work choices. I thought Sean Carney's contribution on work choices was very interesting. I think we made a mistake. When I say we, I mean the government I led, and therefore me, because ultimately I'm responsible for all the mistakes, and rightly so. I think we made a big mistake in taking out the no disadvantage test. I don't think we made a mistake putting in the unfair dismissal provisions. We'd been campaigning to give unfair dismissal relief to small business for years. We'd actually put something like 30 or 40 amendments into the Parliament on that, but we couldn't get it through because we couldn't get enough support in the Senate. The question of whether a different leader would have won, and the only different leader that was obviously in offer was Peter Costello, who was an outstanding treasurer, and we worked in very close professional harmony. I have to put on the record that even when there were some tensions over the leadership, it didn't interfere with the professional cooperation between Peter and me, and between our respective officers. They continued to work very, very closely together. That issue has been done over. I'm interested that you've got the note out of Ian McLaughlin's office, from Ian McLaughlin's wallet, That's quite a museum piece. My observation on that meeting way back in 1994 is outlined in Lazarus Rising in the leadership chapter, but just for the sake of reminding you of it, there were certainly discussions. I certainly indicated I was so fixated on actually getting the government after 12 years in opposition that I certainly did indicate in that discussion that I might only stay at 1 or 2 terms, but there was no deal reached because that did not bring forth an understanding that at that point that I would be elected unopposed, so therefore a deal did not arise. But in any event, it didn't happen. The parliamentary party did not want a change in leader. Whether they were right or wrong is a matter for people to debate. I think it's important to emphasise something that Alexander Downer touched on, and that is that the government I had the privilege of leading is the only government since Federation that has had the same person in the positions of Prime Minister, Foreign Affairs. It used to be called External Affairs until I think it was Bill McMahon who changed the name of it from External Affairs to Foreign Affairs, and Treasurer for the entirety of the government. And that stability, along with the stability in many other areas, was hugely important. And I know it is the custom of politics to call a government by the name of the Prime Minister, the leader, but it was very much a team effort. And I was fortunate to have some wonderful colleagues, a number of extremely able colleagues, and fundamental to that was the coalition. We haven't talked about it much today except by referring to the government as the coalition, but the coalition between the Liberal Party and the National Party was fundamental. We could, in theory, have governed in our own right as a Liberal Party in 1996. We had an absolute majority as Liberals, but there was a suggestion made that that happened, and I rejected it immediately. I said we went to the people as a coalition and we would govern as a coalition. I also knew that that circumstance would only last for 1 term, that by the time of the next election we would lose our capacity to govern in our own right. So I made it very plain that Tim Fischer would become the Deputy Prime Minister in the normal conventions. And this was an article of faith for Menzies. It was an article of faith for Malcolm Fraser. I saw the cooperation between him and Doug Anthony, which was integral to the success of his government. And I can only say that it was a sheer delight to work with Tim Fischer and John Anderson and Mark Vaile. They were all excellent colleagues to work with. I want to thank Professor Rouse and also Roger Beale for their contributions on 2 of the more difficult policy areas. I found Indigenous affairs policy very difficult. I think any Prime Minister, if he or she were honest, would say the same thing. It's a very difficult policy area. I did attach myself very much to the idea of practical reconciliation. I was never attracted to the processes involved in the Bringing Them Home report. I don't think they allowed any kind of scrutiny of any of the allegations and claims that were made. I'm not suggesting that those practices were not embraced and implemented, but as a matter of procedural fairness, it was one of the weaknesses of that process, and it was a concern that I made known to Ronald Wilson and Mick Dodson not long after I became Prime Minister. And I did, as I've indicated in the past, have a fundamental difficulty with one generation presuming to apologise for the behaviour of other generations. I'm rather more attracted to governments apologising for their own mistakes rather than a view about the mistakes of early generations. I don't offer that as any kind of relitigation of the issue, but perhaps in the interest of candour, explaining why I took the position I did. I think Roger identified the timeline very accurately in relation to energy policy. I accept that we took the emissions trading system to the 2007 election, but I think it was one observation I would make to all of you about this debate is that if you're, and I'm surprised in a way it didn't come up in the discussion about the Greens, that in a sense the greatest own goal in climate change policy was the refusal of the Greens to support Rudd's scheme. I mean, that was a classic example of the perfect claiming, you know, the desirable falling victim to the perfect, if I can put it that way. And that was a very, very strange thing. And I think that actually is cast, if you're looking at it in a neutral sense, that has cast a greater cloud over the conduct of climate policy than just about anything else. I think a big mistake was made in extending the Emirates scheme. We, as you rightly recorded, we decided against the Tambling recommendation to put it up to 20%. I hold to the view that the over-incentivising of investment in renewable energy has created the under-investment in other dispatchable forms of baseload power. Now, that's a long argument. We don't have time today. Look, I've just got a couple of observations on issues relating to the public service and then a personal reflection on when I thought we were really in trouble in 2006, 2007. In relation to the public service and the relationship with the office, I think one of the great strengths of the arrangements I had with my own office was that in Arthur Sinodinos, who was a truly outstanding Chief of Staff, and I wish him well as our presumptive ambassador to the United States, Arthur, of course, had been a long-serving Treasury official. He understood the public service. They trusted him and they liked him, and it worked extremely well. And Michael Lestrange, although he'd had quite a period in Tony Abbott's office and had been the executive director of the Menzies Research Institute, he had had quite a career in the public service. So both of them were in no way political blow-ins. Their politics, I report, were quite sound. They were very sound, but they certainly weren't political blow-ins. And I think it's important to get the balance right. And I think, if I can quote Roger again, he did say that the present system can work well. It depends a lot on the personnel. I'm not sure that rules and regulations are going to make it work any better. But if you have somebody who's got political skill in charge of an office but who is sensitive to the proper role of the public service, I think you can achieve the right balance. I can say that in November of 2006, I think I was in Malaysia when Kevin Rudd, it may have been early December, launched his attack on Kim Beazley. And I'd been given a series of benchmark polls which had been carried out on behalf of the Liberal Party. And although we were a considerable distance behind in the national polls, the published polls, those polls gave me cause to believe that we could still win the election. But they did change when Rudd became leader. I have to say that I never thought the Labor Party would make Rudd leader. I thought that his personality for the Labor Party was what was ultimately rejected by the Labor Party, but I didn't think he'd become the leader. But he became the leader, and from the moment he became the leader, he established an ascendancy over me and his party over the coalition. It seemed difficult, and I think, as others have alluded to, the coup de grace in a way was the budget. That budget, according to individual polls done on budgets, is the best received budget in history. I think Peter Costello's best budget was the 1996 budget, which was the one that laid the foundations for the government. But this other one in 2007 was very popular. I mean, it was extremely well received. But we had an ordinary news poll about a week after that. If my recollection is correct, it was something like 59 to 41, two-party preferred. Now, 59 to 41, if you're the 41, is pretty grim. And it was delivered a very, very strong message to me. Two other things. There's been a reference made to middle-class welfare. Now, it's one of those catchphrases that gets heads nodding. You know, you shouldn't have welfare for middle-class people. My view was that family tax benefits were not welfare. Family tax benefits were what they are named. They are tax breaks for the cost of raising children. And I had a very strong view, which I stated long before I became Prime Minister, that if your tax system does not recognise the cost of raising children, it's a tax system without a social vision. And I often said a couple with no children earning $100,000 a year between them, they should not have, and a couple next door with two children earning $100,000 between them, my view is that the couple with the two children should pay less tax. Now, I don't regard that as welfare. I regard it as facing the blind obvious that those of us who have had children understand, and it does cost, and if you want to put it at its most basic, perpetuate the race, then you have to recognise that there is a cost involved. And I don't see those sorts of things as middle-class welfare any more than I see the subsidies through the tax system for private health insurance as middle-class welfare. I see those things very much as maintaining the dual public-private system that we have here in Australia. I make an observation where there's a lot of talk about the Senate. One of the things that struck me very forcibly after I became Prime Minister and as the Greens rose and the Democrats receded was how much more difficult it was to get anything through. If I can sort of put it like this, and from the audience perspective, this is the Labor Party, this is the coalition. Now, I would locate the Democrats about here. They're between us and the Labor Party, but they're closer to the Labor Party than they are to us. But I would put the Greens over there. They are to the left of both the Labor Party and the coalition, and I've been on record in the past, and I'd repeat it here today, that I am totally opposed to the Liberal Party ever preferencing the Greens in order to defeat a Labor candidate for tactical reasons. I would rather, if I were in an electorate and I had to choose between a Green and a Labor candidate, I'd vote Labor rather than vote for a Green. For the simple reason is that they are, in my view, the real radicals or extremists of Australian politics. If we're looking at any change to the Constitution, there's one change to the Constitution that I would put well ahead of any kind of vote on any particular form of Indigenous recognition or, perish the thought, any kind of republic, and that is a vote to alter section 57 of the Constitution, the deadlock provisions, to provide for a joint sitting of the Parliament without the necessity of a prior double dissolution. Now that is not quite as radical as it sounds. In the quick mathematics, as I understand it at the present time, would not necessarily give the current government a majority at a joint sitting, because its majority in the House of Representatives is not all that high. My point simply is that if a government has a clear majority in the lower house, as we did after 96, as the Rudd government did after 2007, as the Abbott government did after 2013, I think a change to that effect to obviate the need for a double dissolution would be sensible. I don't think it's likely to happen, incidentally, but I think it is one of those very sensible reforms. Finally, could I say a couple of things about party organisations? I agreed with the last contribution about the challenge that all political parties have. Political parties now are no longer mass movements of people. Perhaps they never were, but they more closely resembled mass movements in the 50s and 60s. The Liberal Party that I joined in Earlwood was far more representative of the suburb of Earlwood than I think the current Liberal Party branch is. And I'm sure the same thing applies to the Labor Party. We live, of course, in a generation that are not joiners. My generation joined things. They joined political parties in greater numbers. They joined sporting organisations in greater numbers. They joined churches in greater numbers. They joined service clubs in greater numbers. Now, all of that has altered, and that's a great study in its own right. So we don't have very representative political parties now, and one of the challenges the entire Western world has is that you have political parties that are dominated by people who are less representative of the generality of the section of the population that votes for their party than used to be the case 30 or 40 years ago. And that is why you get the phenomenon of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, particularly the former, likely capturing the Democratic Party nomination. It's perhaps why, to my surprise and surprise of many, Donald Trump captured the Republican nomination. It's why Jeremy Corbyn has become leader of the British Labor Party, and that will bring me to another issue, and that is how you choose the leaders. Can I say that I am emphatically opposed to any change in the current practice of the Liberal Party in choosing leaders? I think the first responsibility of a leader in a parliamentary system is to lead the parliamentary party. And unless you do that successfully, you won't succeed, either in opposition or in government. So I'm therefore very strongly of the view that the Liberal Party should retain the current system of just the members of Parliament choosing the leader. There was a famous description given by my dear friend and mentor, the late John Carrick, about the nature of the Liberal Party that Menzies formed, and he said there was an implied covenant in the Liberal Party, and that is that the organisation left it to the parliamentary party to decide policy, properly consulting the organisation about that policy, but in the end it had the sole authority. And equally, the parliamentary party left it to the organisation to choose the candidates. And it's something that's been very jealously guarded over the years. It's often, there wouldn't be many people in this room that might remember that or have read that in 1956, when Eric Harrison, who was the then deputy leader of the Liberal Party and held the federal seat of Wentworth, I think you all know where Wentworth is. It's been held by a series of Liberal Party leaders and a Prime Minister over the years that when Harrison retired, Leslie Berry, who'd been a Treasury official and been at the IMF in Washington, nominated, and obviously Menzies was a supporter, and there was an uproar from the local Liberal Party organisation. So they felt this man, who went on to have a very good career in federal politics, was being imposed on them. It didn't matter that it was the Prime Minister, it was Bob Menzies, at the height of his power in 1956. They were outraged, and several people ran as independent Liberals. And, he just got home, Berry, but it's an illustration of how jealously that's guarded. So I am very much opposed to that. And could I leave two intriguing thoughts in relation to the choice of the leader, and the suggestion was made we might imitate what happens in Britain with the Conservative Party. There was a period in the Conservative Party's history when the sole authority for choosing a leader was in the hands of the Parliamentary Party. It was during that period of time, if my memory serves me correctly, that Margaret Thatcher became the leader of the party, and I hazard the opinion that if the present Conservative Party system had obtained way back in the mid-1970s, then maybe Margaret Thatcher would have lost to her then principal opponent, William Whitelaw, who went on to become the deputy leader of the Conservative Party because he enjoyed far more support in the party organisation. The final intriguing thing I offer to the political scientists in the room to reflect on, and perhaps I'm wrong about this, but when you compare the organisational structure of the Liberal Party, which is federal, and the central executive does not have the same authority as the Labor Party's national executive, I pose the question to them that if the Labor Party in the middle 1950s, when it suffered its most horrendous split, and which led to the formation of the DLP, it had the same structure as the Liberal Party had in the 1950s. The split may not have occurred because the federal executive, the national executive of the Labor Party, would not have had the authority to sack the grouper-dominated Victorian branch of the Labor Party. It's just an intriguing hypothetical what if, and I'm sure there are some explanations where that theory is wrong, but like so many people who follow political science as a career, I regard myself as a bit of an amateur in political science on occasions, and I just throw that in as a random thought. But again, can I say thank you very, very warmly to everybody who's participated. I've found it an invigorating experience. I value proper examination and analysis of what my government did. I'm proud of what it did, but it made its share of mistakes like all other governments, and it's tremendously important that we have this capacity to talk about it and compare and contrast. But most importantly, I thank those who worked with me for those 11 years, 8 months and 23 days and how many minutes, Tom? Yeah. So I thank you very, very much. Thank you. Yes.
You thought for most of 2007 you were going to lose. In the moments you didn't think you were going to lose, did you turn your mind ever to when you would go in the next term?
Oh, no, what I said was that if we won, after a decent period of time, I'd go.
What's a decent period
well,
of time?
Probably 18 months.
18 months.
Yeah, but look, it's about to be academic now, isn't it?
And the second one was, can you tell us whether if you had beaten Maxine McHugh, you would have served the full term of the next parliament?
Well, I had given an undertaking to that effect, so yes. In a sense, it was a neat solution. And the Liberal Party found in John Alexander somebody who could win the seat, and he turned out to be a very good member. But it was a sort of a neat solution. My seat had a margin of 4.2% because I'd had been progressively mangled by redistribution. There was nothing wrong with the redistribution, it was just a drift of population. And I was down to 4.2%. And the swing in New South Wales against the coalition was about 5%, a bit more, so I went out. I lost a marginal seat. I had said that I'd serve out the term, so I'd have been under very understandable pressure, apart from the commitment I made from the party to stay. Would we have won the by-election if I'd have gone? I don't. Well, it's interesting. Brendan Nelson had a very good victory, or the coalition had a very good victory in, was it the Gippsland? Was it the by-election that brought, was it when Peter McGorrin went? Yeah, and that was halfway through 2008. He had a very good victory in that. But once again, it's an academic question now.
And I'm an academic and I ask those kind of questions.
You do, yeah.
Please thank Mr. Howard.
Thank you. Thanks.